but participate, make suggestions, things like that. And even as a 6-year-old, I mean, my dad was having to read the lines at the read-through, and I would just kind of sit there at first. My father...
Ron Howard is the ultimate nice guy. We know him as the polite kid and the steady director. But staying at the top for 60 years requires more than just kindness. It requires a thick skin. Behind his famous smile lies a history of difficult sets and clashing egos. Howard didn't just witness greatness. He survived it. These are the 6 actors who challenged his patience and showed him the industry's sharpest edges. Frances Bavier, the mask of the matriarch to the millions of Americans who tuned into the Andy Griffith Show during the 60s. Frances Bavier was the personification of domestic warmth. As Aunt Bee, she was the stabilizing force of Mayberry, a woman whose biggest concerns were the quality of her pickles and the safety of her nephew Opie. But for the young Ron Howard, the reality of working with Bavier was his first masterclass in the jarring disconnect between a public persona and a private reality. While the world saw doting Aunt, the cast and crew saw a classically trained New York stage actress who lived in a state of perpetual icy professional disdain. Bavier did not see herself as part of an ensemble of good old boys in a rural comedy. She saw herself as a serious dramatic artist trapped in a medium she considered beneath her. This created a neat kind of friction on set, a quiet evil of emotional coldness that a child actor like Howard was uniquely sensitive to. In a town like Mayberry, which was built on the foundation of communal love, Bavier was an island of professional austerity. She didn't want to be Aunt Bee. Once the cameras stopped rolling, she wanted to be respected, and she felt that a sitcom about a small-town sheriff was an insult to her pedigree. For Howard, Bavier represented the professional disdain archetype. This isn't the loud explosive anger of a diva, but rather the slow-burn resentment of someone who feels overqualified for their life. Howard has recounted in interviews in his memoir The Boys that Bavier was not a fan of the hijinks that Andy Griffith and Don Knotts engaged in. While the men were laughing and ad-libbing, Bavier remained rigid. As a child, Howard looked to the adults on set for cues on how to behave. From Griffith, he learned leadership and humor. From Bavier, he learned that the person smiling at you in the script might be the one most likely to ignore you at the craft services table. The tension was not merely atmospheric. It was a wall. Howard noted that Bavier was deeply offended by the casual nature of the set. She reportedly once took a swing at actor Jim Nabors with an umbrella because his singing annoyed her. For a young Ronnie Howard, this was a confusing introduction to the mask of Hollywood. He had to learn to perform intimacy with a woman who in reality offered him nothing but polite distance or visible annoyance. This taught Howard a vital directorial lesson. The performance of chemistry is often an act of sheer will rather than a reflection of genuine affection. Bavier's behavior was a manifestation of the Golden Age. Ego, a belief that the craft of acting was a sacred, somber duty that should not be degraded by child's play or rural tropes. She struggled with the fact that despite her decades of stage work, she would only ever be remembered for a character she essentially despised. This resentment bled into her interactions with Howard. She wasn't mean in the traditional sense. But she was emotionally unavailable, creating a vacuum where a young performer expected a mentor. It was a coldness that forced Howard to grow up faster, realizing that a family on screen is often just a collection of strangers holding a contract. This friction reached its peak during the later years of the show. While the rest of the cast remained a tight-knit unit, Bavier retreated further into her shell. She eventually retired to North Carolina, becoming recluse and refusing to participate in many of the reunions that Howard and Griffith cherished. It was a tragic end to a career defined by a woman who couldn't reconcile her talent with her fame. Howard has often spoken of her with a mix of pity and respect, acknowledging that her unhappiness made her difficult, but her discipline made her a pro. By navigating the chilly waters of Bavier's temperament, Howard learned the first rule of Hollywood survival: the character is a lie. He learned that you could create a masterpiece of warmth while standing in a room full of ice. Bavier was the first person to show him that behind the gilded image of a Hollywood legend, there's often a person struggling with a profound sense of misplaced identity. She was his first encounter with the Golden Age ghost. The actor who is haunted by the roles they feel they should have played. But if Bavier was a cold breeze in a small town, the next encounter was a hurricane in a silk robe. Yell Briner, the Tyrannoff the icon. If Francis Bevere represented the cold internal resentment of a fading era, Yellbrunner was the opposite, a blazing external sun that demanded every planet in the room orbit around him. Ron Howard encountered Briner on the set of the 1959 film The Journey. Howard was only 5 years old, a tiny red-headed boy. Thrust into the presence of a man who didn't just play kings. He believed he was one. Briner, famous for his shaved head and his booming authoritative voice in The King, and I carried an aura of absolute power that made no concessions for the presence of a child. This was Howard's first encounter with the divine right of kings, an archetype of the golden age where the star was not just a lead actor but a sovereign ruler of the set. Briner's evil, if one could call it, that was a form of psychological intimidation. He moved through the production with rigid, terrifying grace for a child like Howard who was used to the gentle paternal guidance of his own father, Rance Howard. Briner was an alien force. He was a man who didn't speak. He issued decrees. He didn't walk. He processed. Howard recalls being genuinely frightened by Briner's intensity. The actor had a way of looking through people rather than at them. A technique designed to maintain his status as the most important person in any room. In the world of 50s cinema, stars like Briner were protected by a studio system that treated them as gods. And Briner leaned into that divinity with every fiber of his being. This was a lesson in the atmosphere of fear. Howard watched as adult crew members, seasoned professionals who had worked on dozens of films, scrambled to appease Briner's every whim. If the lighting wasn't perfect, if a line was flubbed, if the energy on set wasn't exactly to his liking, Briner's disapproval wasn't a conversation. It was a climate shift. For Howard, this was a formative experience in understanding how a single ego can hijack a collective creative process. It was the antithesis of the collaborative spirit Howard would later champion as a director. Briner was the immovable object, a man whose commitment to his own myth outweighed the comfort of his colleagues. The friction here wasn't born of a personal grudge. It's unlikely Briner even considered a 5-year-old a peer worth having a grudge with, but rather a fundamental clash of philosophies. He was a king without a kingdom, ruling over a soundstage with an iron fist, leaving a young Ron Howard to wonder if there was a way to reach the top without losing one's humanity. Briner ruled by presence. But in the 80s, Howard would face a new kind of defiance, the intellectual blockade. Shelley Long, The Perfectionists, Purgatory, where Yellbrunner's dominance was a relic of a vanishing empire. Shelley Long represented a modern, more cerebral kind of friction. By 1982, Ron Howard was at a crossroads. He was no longer the child actor under the thumb of icons. He was a young director trying to prove he had the authority to lead amateur feature film. The project was Night Shift, a comedy that required a delicate balance of zany energy and grounded heart. In Shelley Long, Howard found a brilliant comedian, but he also encountered an analytical anchor and actress whose process was so meticulous in questioning that it threatened to bring the production to a halt. Long came from the rigorous world of Chicago's Second City, a background that emphasized intellectual deconstruction and character motivation. While Michael Keaton was improvising at a mile a minute and Henry Winkler was leaning into his natural warmth, Long was off in the breaks on the set. She didn't just want to say the lines. She wanted to know the molecular structure of why her character Belinda would choose those specific words. For Howard, this was a baptism into the world of star management. He wasn't just directing a movie. He was negotiating a daily peace treaty between the schedule and a star's obsessive perfectionism. The friction with Long wasn't born of malice, but of a mismatch in tempo. Howard, having grown up in the high-efficiency world of sitcoms where time is money valued momentum, Long conversely seemed to view the set as a laboratory. Industry lore and cast reflections from that era often paint a picture of an actress who was not always the easiest to get along with. Not because she was a diva in the fur coat and tantrum sense, but because she was a perfectionist who could be oblivious to the needs of the ensemble. On the set of Night Shift, this manifested as endless questions and a desire for one more take. Long after the director was satisfied, Howard had to learn a vital lesson in directorial psychology: that analytical anchor isn't trying to be evil. They are trying to be safe. For Long, the scrutiny of every detail was a shield against failure. But for a director, that shield can become a wall. Howard found himself in a position where he had to validate her concerns without letting them sabotage the film's energy. This was his first real experience